Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can talk about this trend we see in blogs and on the internet and on YouTube about narcissistic abuse syndrome. I've had a lot of questions about this, especially from clinicians, from other counselors, as well as individuals from other professions like social workers, psychologists, and psychiatrists. And they've been asking me if I would address the phenomenon, this uptick in information being produced about narcissistic abuse syndrome, and it has a few other names, and I'll go through that in a second. So what we really see here is, with this narcissistic abuse syndrome, is this is not actually a disorder. There's no classification in the DSM that lines up with this. We see these different websites and YouTube channels and everything listing symptoms. A lot of these symptoms look like they're similar to PTSD. They suggest that it should be a new diagnosis. Some suggest it already is a diagnosis. Others say it's underdiagnosed. And then still we see those that say it's more serious than disorders in the DSM. You also have people correcting other people about the name. Some people call it narcissistic victim syndrome or narcissistic abuse victim syndrome, and then you see these other people, as I mentioned, correcting and saying, no, it's really narcissistic abuse syndrome. So as we can see, there's really a poor understanding of narcissism here and of classification with the DSM. I see with these sources, let's call them sources, I'll just put them all together, we see blaming science as a popular theme here, suggesting that individuals who are narcissistic learn to be narcissistic by reading scientific literature, and this leads to this abuse syndrome. They suggest that the only way of knowing something is if you experienced it yourself. So if somebody has lived with a narcissist or interacted with a narcissist, they're the only people that can understand narcissism. So again, kind of an anti-science theme. We also see attempts at generating a treatment protocol for this disorder that, of course, isn't a disorder. And one of the treatments is to learn a lot about narcissists. That's actually part of the therapy as it's conceptualized by a lot of these sources. Another trend I see with this narcissistic abuse syndrome thing is that people say that if clinicians, if licensed and qualified clinicians won't help, go to life coaches. So really we see here individuals who potentially have mental health symptoms being redirected from qualified clinicians over to life coaches and promoting an unregulated business. So I talked about in a prior video how life coaches aren't equipped to treat mental health symptoms, but that's what this whole narcissistic abuse syndrome promotion is doing. Another interesting trend I see with this whole narcissistic abuse syndrome promotion is the idea that well-meaning clinicians will tell you that's not in the DSM. So they're saying that clinicians, counselors, mean to do well, but they are misinformed, that somehow counselors, again the qualified individuals, are telling you it's not in the DSM, but that makes them incompetent. So we have this kind of weird logic that's being set up. The licensed and qualified clinicians are somehow bad because they refuse to give a diagnosis that is in fact not present in the DSM. And there's this idea that good counselors, good clinicians, will assign the diagnosis. Again, there's no way to assign the diagnosis, so it gets into a real logic problem. So I've kind of outlined narcissistic abuse syndrome as I see it. So how about what's really going on? What do we really see here with this construct, and is it a real syndrome? How does it hold together? Well, it gets difficult here to know where to start because there's so much misinformation about narcissism on YouTube and the internet in general. But I'm going to start with the idea of narcissistic abuse. I've talked about this in prior videos. The idea that somebody can be abused by someone who is narcissistic, that's a real thing. That does happen. Somebody can also be abused by someone who has antisocial personality features, by somebody who's depressed, by somebody who's anxious, by somebody who has OCD. All these types of abuse could exist. Someone could be abused by someone who has no mental disorders or no mental health symptoms at all. So we see there's a real focus here just on narcissism. Like the abuse that occurs with narcissism must create symptoms that kind of cluster together. Now, I have no problem with colloquial terms, right? We see a lot of colloquial terms being used that aren't official terms in mental health counseling. And the reason I'm okay with this is I think this is how the ideas for new disorders can potentially get started. We see a lot of promising ideas out there that someday maybe will turn into disorders, and maybe they won't, but they can still be useful even as they are. For example, maladaptive daydreaming, the construct of quiet borderline personality disorder, or a construct like vulnerable narcissism. We see vulnerable narcissism as not only a colloquial term, it's used quite a bit in the research, and it's well established, but it's not in the DSM. Somebody who has vulnerable narcissism could still be treated, even though there's no disorder that lines up with that really well. Now, this idea of narcissistic abuse syndrome being an actual syndrome and people should diagnose it and all this, this is really not a good idea. This is a dangerous practice, promoting something ahead of science, saying that you figured out that there's some sort of syndrome when the evidence doesn't support it. This so-called syndrome has not been studied. It's not under consideration, at least not as far as I'm aware. Therefore, it's not a disorder. There is a route to go for a construct to become a disorder, and narcissistic abuse syndrome is not on that route. It's not on that pathway to becoming an official classification. Now, we use classifications because we see symptoms that tend to group together over many people in a population. And we don't necessarily need every situation to become a diagnosis. A lot of times a group of symptoms will be present, and diagnostically those symptoms can fit into any number of disorders. And sometimes that's what happens. You see several disorders being diagnosed, or one disorder being diagnosed, but it doesn't line up perfectly with the symptoms. There may be more symptoms than are included in that particular diagnosis. That's not necessarily always problematic. When it comes to emotional abuse symptoms, or really any symptoms, more diagnoses isn't always the answer. Some would argue that in the DSM we already have too many diagnoses, that it's too complex, and it's not accurately capturing the constructs that would help us to deliver treatment. I think one of the interesting things about this idea of narcissistic abuse syndrome is that the personality disorder that it's partially based on, narcissistic personality disorder, was almost dropped from the current version of the DSM. So even those symptoms didn't cluster together, didn't hold together well enough for some people to want it to stay a disorder. So as you can see, I'm not a big fan of this trend. I'm not a big fan of creating constructs and then promoting them and then saying that counselors are somehow the bad guys because we won't use them, because we won't violate ethics and we continue to practice in a competent manner. Somehow that's become bad. That's really a turned around logic, as I mentioned before. So I thought, because everyone has created a name for this, we have all these different names for this supposed syndrome, that I would create my own name. I mean, a lot of people are writing blogs about this, creating YouTube videos, so I thought, well, I'll give it a shot. So here's what I came up with. I came up with a name for this syndrome: negative overt narcissism, systematic exposure, non-traditional syndrome equivalent. I'll let you figure out how that acronym works out. So we can see this abuse syndrome is really hurting people who get abused by people that are narcissistic. Right? This is a bad thing for everybody. It's a bad thing for victims. It's a bad thing for the counseling community. It's essentially anti-science. And what we see here is a misunderstanding of how deductive reasoning works versus inductive reasoning. So in science we actually use both, but a lot of times people think of science as mostly deductive reasoning, the part of science with experimentation anyway. So we have a theory, we come up with a theory, and then we look for evidence to support the theory. So we'll look at a population, sample population, say of people that are narcissistic, and we'll propose a theory about what we're going to find in that observation. So we might say that narcissists would do this or do that in a particular situation. That's our theory, and then we go and test it. Inductive reasoning is when you start with the data and then you generalize to the population. So this would be the kind of reasoning that somebody might use if they know someone who's narcissistic. They might say, well, this person who is narcissistic tends to manipulate people. Therefore, everyone who's narcissistic must manipulate people. Now, manipulation is one of the characteristics of narcissism, but you can see the flaw here with just using inductive reasoning. It creates kind of an anti-science bias to not include deductive reasoning. And also, telling people to avoid qualified licensed clinicians is dangerous. We want to point people who are having difficulties in the direction of qualified counselors. So as I mentioned, the person really hurt here is the victim. They're victimized by someone who's narcissistic or by someone who's not, but either way they're victimized. And we see this industry that's created to move them to online life coaching. So maybe this whole narcissistic abuse syndrome thing really comes down to money. But either way, it doesn't help the victim to attack science. And also, not all abuse leads to pathology. Counselors can help people even if they come in without an official DSM diagnosis or if they're undiagnosable. So if somebody has emotional difficulties or other symptoms because of narcissistic abuse or because of any reason, a counselor can usually help, and the diagnosis is just something that may be there or may not be there. What gets tricky with the diagnosis, of course, is a lot of times for insurance companies to reimburse, a diagnosis does need to be given. But like I said, there's a number of diagnoses already available, and those symptoms of narcissistic abuse would oftentimes fit into one of those diagnostic classifications. So this whole thing with narcissistic abuse syndrome, I think really there's so many problems with it, and it just seems so illogical to me and harmful to the individuals that counselors would treat. I think it's something that just needs to be dismissed. We need to move past kind of the sensationalism and some of the drama and whatever's going on with the money and the life coaching and all that, and move back to science. Let's use the methods that we've used before that we know work to come up with answers that can help people. This isn't about creating a new industry around narcissism. Narcissism and the abuse that occurs around it is a mental health issue. And I think it's really important that we keep the focus there. I hope you found this video about the so-called narcissistic abuse syndrome situation to be interesting. Thanks for watching.